Welcome, and we're happy you've got to this point. I know it's been a long process, and not without twists and turns. So you know, your mentor, Dr. Lee, has left the university and was unable to continue. So we're happy that we're able to come together and finish this project with you. So you know, everyone has read the thesis. Maybe not your family, but it's uh, historical analysis of study abroad trends dating back from the 19th century to today, from China to the United States. And the way that we'll do the defense is you will tell us about your thesis, what you tried to accomplish, and how you tried to accomplish it. So tell us about your sources and your methodology, and then what you accomplished, so your contributions, and then maybe where you fell short and how you could overcome those shortcomings if you had the chance to redo the project or expand on it. And then we'll ask questions. And then after we've asked you some questions, we will, the three readers will go to a breakout room and confer for a few minutes, and then we'll come back and conclude the defense.
Okay.
Are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right. So please tell us about your thesis.
Yeah. First, want to say thank you all for reading and being on the committee and helping me out with this process. It means a lot to have a vote of confidence to get to this point. So without a further ado, I'll go ahead. My defense speech will kind of be exactly like Dr. Shank mentioned. I'll go from I'll start with what I tried to show in my thesis, how I go about doing it, and my sources and methodology. And I'll move on to what I think my greatest contributions were, and vastly the greatest challenges that I faced and what I would do differently. So, of course, let me begin. Since I'd like to start off by saying, since my time being at a boarding school, I was very interested in the motivations of Chinese students or just international students in general to study for long periods of time in the US, which at that period of time, that's early study abroad before undergraduate. So I felt that choice was different than the major life choice to go abroad for just one semester, which was an experience that I knew I wanted to have in college, and was lucky enough to get that experience through Croft. And throughout high school, I occasionally discussed the topic at great length with my classmates from those other countries. And I even felt grieved whenever one of them decided to leave the country, or their family pulled them back from the school. So I continued to follow the trend, especially of Chinese students studying in the US, due to my interest in the Chinese language and culture. And I discovered that the movement, which had much momentum before, had slowed down greatly. I decided, therefore, to do my thesis on what factors I believed were behind this slowdown in international education between China and America. And in my thesis, I wanted to show mainly that things had happened to upset the trend, not merely as some writers kind of think that the study abroad fever was dying in China, but rather that the trend was being upset as it had in the past. So with clear influential factors identified, that is how I show that the third wave will end. And so how do I do that? It was very clear to me in the past few years that a lot had happened to influence cross-cultural education. I had even done extensive research and gathered a lot of sources to talk about contemporary study abroad, but I felt more was missing from my analysis at that point. I had already begun the thesis, but I felt I needed more. And that is when I learned that there had been major study abroad waves in the past from China. And even then, major events upset the institutions in place for study abroad in those respective times. So that's when I set off trying to draw parallels between what now I know to be the three different waves of study abroad from China to America. And also to do this, I had to understand the migrational theory of push and pull factors, which became an important part to the thesis. I just knew there had to be commonalities between the students from those three different waves. So from finding the common push factors that pushed them away from China in the first place, and the pull factors that drew the students to the US specifically, and also from finding what degree of events halted those exchanges, I developed a clear understanding of what the third wave and just of the third wave and what I believed would be its ultimate demise. I move on to sources. As far as the sources go, I got my thesis started by researching contemporary study abroad issues. As interesting as I find the third wave to be, there's not a whole lot of literature existing about the late third wave, but there are plenty of newspaper articles about it. As media outlets have reported on individual stories and collective trends alike. There's also plenty of data gathered by governmental organizations and private organizations about study abroad. So I leaned on Statista or Statista for that information whenever it was available for free or with an access. To learn more about the previous waves, though, I found books and other miscellaneous secondary sources to be the most helpful, such as in the first wave. While I was in Mississippi for the summer, I was able to make use of the library, the academic one, of course, to read through a book about Chinese educational mission, which is where this whole adventure kind of begins. And at that same time, I was enrolled in online classes, summer classes, at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. And when I was done with my research on the first wave, I was able to use my enrollment in UNCW to look at their library repository, and that gave me access to a book about the second wave, Boxer indemnity scholars, and Chinese students in general during the Republican and warlord eras. I also had access to the book that I ended up using as my source for push and pull factors from the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. For the latter part of the 1900s of the 20th century, I had to use a variety of secondary sources to fill in my gap about study abroad for the beginning of the third wave. And this mostly made up of immigration policy papers and other scholarly works. And I think lastly, the final source is myself, my personal experiences and exchanges I'd gathered over the years. And I think that was important for me because information that I already had let me begin with an understanding of where the thesis was going, what direction to take it. But I definitely stayed open to new information, which allowed me to be adaptive. And a last point about sources is it was one of my challenges to know when to stop taking new information in. which proved tricky, but I'll get back to that in a bit. My greatest contribution, I think, lies in the qualitative analysis that I provide, specifically in the area of early study abroad, because previous works on Chinese study abroad talk little, if at all, about students coming to America before they begin their undergraduate studies. And I think it's important to acknowledge this aspect of cross-cultural exchange, because a slowdown in high school student enrollment in the US of Chinese students could very well relate to a slowdown in Chinese college student enrollment. And of course, as I mentioned in the thesis, South Korea is a perfect example of just this type of phenomenon. And that kind of discovery of mine that I made through a book that Dr. Lee suggested really owes thanks to his direction in that area. And lastly, my challenges. My greatest challenge probably was communicating virtually and conducting this thesis largely independently. Of course, I think that was a big challenge. And another challenge that I'd already mentioned was knowing when to stop taking new information in. I really could discuss the topic and write on it for a lot longer if I wanted, and if I had a direction to go in. But I think graduation and, of course, kind of common sense dictated that I try to bring the process to a close. And this challenge kind of extended in a way into avoiding adding sections to the thesis of material that were potentially relevant, but in the grand scheme of things, unhelpful for my argument. So there were those kind of obstacles to overcome. But if I could do the whole thing over, or if I continue my education and conduct a thesis in the future on this very topic, which at the time I feel drawn towards doing after a year or two of work experience, I would do two things. First would be to conduct my own research, and by that I mean like do my own surveys and interviews. As this time around, I didn't have that clearance or time to get clearance, but being able to have my own original content and interviews to base my analysis on would be very beneficial for me. Not to say that existing surveys didn't help me out plenty, because I believe that they did, but I would have been, it would have been helpful to have answers to questions that were solicited, questions that I designed with my thesis in mind. That is what would have helped me out more. And lastly, I would heed the advice of pretty much everyone and not have the project draw on longer than it is intended to, because drawing the project out had the consequence of making, at least while it made me very familiar with my work, it had the consequence of giving me a kind of bias towards my work, and maybe even tunnel vision, and making it difficult to see mistakes that I had made or areas that I needed to tighten up my argument. And in that regard, I was lucky to have the support of my family and peers, and of course my readers, to look over my work and assure me that what I had created was coherent and okay. And I think that sums up the challenges and what I would do. So that's the end of my spiel, if we want to continue on to the next part.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Yeah. So I definitely appreciate the obstacles and everything that you faced. And so, yeah, we're ready for some questions. I don't know if either of you have any questions to start. Dr. Howard or Dr. Guo?
in that order, or?
However you want to do it. It's up to whoever's ready to ask a question.
Okay. I'll just jump in with I guess an easy question for you. So I'm very first. Let me say that I'm very impressed by your meticulous research and the 86-page thesis. But you mentioned that you were thinking of that if you have more time, you could add more sections, additional sections. So I'm curious what topics you would cover in those sections. And second question, kind of related to that, is obviously you made so from my kind of social scientific interpretation of your model. So political tensions between the two countries is one of the independent variables or explanatory variables. But if I think about like South Korea, you touched on that already, and also Japan and Taiwan and other East Asian countries that didn't experience the same kind of political tension, but still had a dramatic drop in the number of students to the United States in recent decades. So I wonder if you could say a few words about that as well. Thank you.
Sure. Well, that's fresh. I do know South Korea's drop. I nearly hit on it during my during my explanation, is connected to a saturation in their job market of English speaking citizens. So that was their reason to want to go abroad. The big reason that was cited in surveys and in push and pull factors, South Koreans went to Western countries, English speaking countries, because they wanted to have a really good base in English, and they sent them from an early age. Even like elementary school students would go abroad for an education in a Western country to have a good base in English. But their market became saturated in English speakers over time, and I think they might just be. It could be they're a little bit ahead of China in the curve of study abroad, and I foresee China having that issue as well, because they have drastically increased the amount of English education in their institutions, not only at an upper level but in an elementary level as well. Students are learning English, so that could be an obstacle they face in study abroad. But keep in mind that China's or Chinese students as a whole, most of them cite just wanting to understand Western culture as their reason to go abroad. It's they don't necessarily say it's for the language benefit. And to answer your first question about topics that I would have included if they were more relevant, I was a little bit after I submitted my final draft, I felt that I maybe had not touched on Americanization enough, and I felt for the third wave at least. I know that I mentioned it in the first wave because the Qing dynasty brought back the Chinese educational mission students because there was a large degree of Americanization. But in this third wave, I did mention that nationalistic zeal kind of trumped those fears of not having students coming back. So China allowed students to go abroad and restricted the access to study abroad, allowing more self-funded students to go. And what I would have maybe done for the third wave, if it were more relevant, or if it would change my argument at all, would be to mention the recent pro-democracy protests. At least in 2018 and 2017, I think there was a big divide between Chinese international students across the world, because some of them supported pro-democracy movements, and some of them felt that those students were upsetting a balance, and a lot of students were getting ostracized from even their friends back home, or friends abroad at their universities abroad were getting ostracized. And the only reason that I didn't think that had a whole lot of weight to bring into the thesis was I didn't think that it changed many students' minds about if they would go abroad. If a student was still thinking about going abroad, and they were and they were leaning one way or another, I just don't think that would in a big way affect their decision making. And that's just one I have on the top of my head.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you for the question.
Dr. Howard, you're muted. There you go.
Thanks. Sorry. Still getting used to the technology. Could I add or piggyback on Dr. Guo's question about the importance of U.S.-China relations, the political relationship? You weigh, or, well, I'll just ask it like this. How would you weigh the importance of these different factors? The political relationship and the internal reforms that China's pursuing to stem brain drain. I don't get a sense from your thesis that you've made up your mind. So I want to give you the chance here to convince me that there's one factor that's more important than the others.
Yes, of course. So I think that these factors, in the way that they impact, the numbers of students coming abroad, and of course, individual choices make up trends, and you see this very big slowdown in study abroad, starting in the mid 2010s, near the beginning of where these relations started to sour. The big impact of those relations really is what they mean for the pursuit of study abroad. When there's a visa war going on, of course, students are aware of that, and it makes going abroad to that country more difficult, or there's more bureaucratic red tape to cross. And that makes it easier to go to other countries, and maybe they're more inclined, if they are themselves weighing out their decision, they may be more inclined to go an easier route. But for a lot of these students, they're seeking a degree from a renowned institution. So the honest answer is that it really is a difficult thing to ascertain, but there are a predecessor to my thesis said that the students don't really consider negative relations, at least that in itself is not a reason for them to decide not to come to the country. So what I did end up clarifying, I believe in my third question, is that these these factors, or in the conclusion is these factors, while themselves don't weigh very heavily on the students' minds, they do impact the numbers or the benefit of coming to America, like the trade war. There will be, if that impacts doing business internationally, then students that are wanting to go abroad and have a fast track to a good job in international business or working in an American company might feel less inclined to do so if there's not much growth in that area.
Okay. Do you have a follow-up, Dr. Howard, or can I go next?
Go ahead, go ahead.
Yeah. So one of the things I think was interesting about your thesis is the way you compared the different waves. And, you know, I think that the first two waves, you know, really clearly ended, at least in my understanding of what you wrote, because of a you know, a real, almost, you know, a revolution in China in those cases. You know, that I mean, the first was kind of a self-contained thing anyway. I mean, it was a mission, and once it ended. But the second ended because of the, you know, Communist Party takeover of China, and so you had broken relations with the United States for a while. And you know, you say that the third wave, you know, could end in a similar way, but would that mean that there would be like a fundamental change in Chinese government or American government or something that would, you know, make it almost impossible for students to come? Or is it more a question of the third wave might end at least as a massive wave because you know, at the end of your thesis you argued maybe that the Chinese education system was catching up and there wasn't as much of an incentive for students to study abroad. And so I guess, so that's my first question is, how do you think, like, just speaking now kind of succinctly is, you know, I'm curious, how do you think the third wave would end and why?
Right. The commonalities that I found between the first and second wave and their closures were that the government wasn't funding as many students to go abroad, and I had reason to believe, you know, the second wave is recognized as beginning with the Boxer Indemnity scholars, and there is evidence of provincial governors sending students abroad, like Yuan Shikai himself was he studied abroad in Japan, and the government wanted to send students abroad to have a pipeline of foreign educated government officials in the end, and that was evident through their testing and the civil testing and examinations. But when those waves ended were when there was a massive drop in government funded students. And this current study abroad wave is a little like the second, in that a lot of students that went abroad in the second were self-funded as well.
Mm-hmm.
But in this third wave, a vast majority of Chinese international students are self-funded. And while that makes it different, I do think that if the government just ends up refusing to send Chinese students to America, whether they have a change in government or if America has a change in government and it's a retaliatory trend, or if they don't see the benefit of sending students abroad anymore,
right,
then that will be a signifier for the end of the third wave. And of course, them advancing their educational capacities and enacting educational reform is a big influence in that way, because they're making themselves more self-sustainable, and China is going to want to kind of put its money where its mouth is. And this new world class policy that they're going to enact, or they're enacting since the mid 2000s, is aimed, or mid 2010s again, is aimed towards making their universities world class and start exporting international education. And it's not going to maybe look too good for them if they are still sending a lot of students abroad while trying to export education.
Yeah, that actually brings me to another question, which really wasn't related to the first question I asked you, but it's related to what you just said. I think it's an interesting one, and you don't really address this in your thesis, but it's, to me, it's kind of like thinking about the future of study abroad from China, like students from in China, Chinese students wanting to study abroad. And, in the first two phases, and then even in the third phase or wave, whatever you call it, and up to today, you have this kind of, attitude, implicit or explicit, of inferiority towards a Western education, that the Chinese students have to go to the West, in the United States, to get somehow a better education or a different education than the one that they can get at home. And, if, obviously students in the United States don't, maybe they can get a better education in other places, but that's not why we encourage students to study abroad. We don't say, oh, you need to go to China because they have a better university system, or even France. Or, if you start going to Europe, maybe there's some questions, and people may say, oh, get a master's in France or a master's in UK or something. But do you think that, that attitude could change, that rather than Chinese students coming abroad because they think somehow they're getting a better education, it's just an international experience, or English is just a useful language to learn. It's useful to be exposed to other cultures. The Croft Institute sends students abroad not because we think they get a better education somewhere else. They may, but because we think international experience and immersion and language learning, all those things are important. So, and I think, when European students study abroad, or other students from other parts of the world, it's kind of that same attitude. So do you think that there could be a change that wouldn't mean the end of study abroad from China, but would mean that it's just part of students' experience? Or is there something different about the way, Chinese think about education that they wouldn't do that? I don't know. I'm asking you.
I think they think a lot like us Crofties. Their main reason to go abroad is to gain an understanding of Western culture, and for us, it's to gain an understanding of whatever culture it is that you're studying. So I got into this topic because I didn't like to see the trend going down, and I wanted to understand it. And I thought maybe in the future I could work in this area and try and flip it, to make it go in a positive trend again. But I think that in the end, maybe it'll be a fair exchange. I think, of course, Obama tried to increase the amount of students going to China and the amount of students learning Chinese, K through 12. And that boded well for relations. And Chinese are learning English because that's a major language in the world. I do think that. Sorry, your question is, will their attitudes change towards it, kind of?
Well, just so that, because I see this as a difference maybe from the past, to kind of like a mature, with a mature or world-class education system like you described. Just because you have a world-class education system doesn't mean students are still, students may not be studying abroad because they feel like they can get a better education abroad. They may just be studying abroad for things you said, the desire to learn the language, the international experience. Can you see a shift towards that kind of dynamic rather than, a model of like, I'm going to get an education I can't get at home?
Right. Well, yeah, their world-class education model is fairly new, and each new Chinese president enacts different policies for growth, and has their own ambitions for growth. And Xi Jinping has been very interested in improving Chinese educational system, and he's done very well at that and increasing their capacity. China does have really good universities now, and they even did then. It was just your capability of testing into those places.
Mm-hmm.
You had less than 10% of Gaokao or testers that could go to university when the third wave really kicked off. So they had to look somewhere else for it. And it kind of depends on what each student is looking for in their education. Chinese students really are looking for good employment. And this younger wave, or this younger generation, is going to have very big stress because of the one-child policy. Not only are they looking after two of their parents on their own, but the four grandparents on top of that. And then when they get married, mm-hmm. which a lot of students are kind of thinking they don't want to get married, they're going to have another set of parents and grandparents to look after.
Mm-hmm.
So a job is really important to them, and a good job is really important. So it's all about kind of obtaining that, I think, and that's kind of where this is going to go. Whether their family decides to send their only child, or as the new generation grows up, if with their siblings, if they will still see the value of sending one student or both of it, or one child or both children abroad, if that will still be worth it. Of course, it's not just America and China. They're sending almost an equal amount of students to the UK at the moment. So, and other countries are growing in popularity. But I do think the attitudes will change. I think it is a very dynamic topic, and I'm excited to follow it, whether that is by writing or just by following it through my own interest. Do you have a question, Josh or Mr. Howard?
I did. Do you have a breakdown of, at the undergraduate and graduate level, of what Chinese students are studying, what their majors are, what they're doing in graduate school?
Yes. In my breakdown of students per year, data is not terribly, the data is not terribly reliable year to year, but a majority of students are in the STEM fields. And then a close second was business. And beyond that, it's other liberal arts degrees, and humanities follows that. Yeah. But
well, if STEM is so important, wouldn't that suggest that with a new administration that maybe wants to mend fences with China, that it's in the U.S. interest to continue to recruit, particularly graduate students, to work in our labs and study in our graduate schools. Does that give you kind of, because in your presentation, you talked about the demise of this third wave as it's inevitably going to be over. I'm just pressing you on that.
Mm-hmm. I had to have a kind of a definitive way to take my thesis, and I thought the way things were going, that is where it leads to. And the reason I wasn't shying away from saying that that was the demise, no matter what administration gets in, is because I'd seen articles about the different hypotheticals that a new administration wouldn't shake up policy that much, because policy that had been enacted now and in recent years is policy that is supported on both sides of the aisle, and really there wasn't a whole lot of information to go off of for what Biden would do in his administration regarding China, but Trump was very outspoken about what he would do, and with that information, as well as the hypotheticals that I had access to with those articles, like a Forbes article, which I cited in the thesis, those gave me an understanding that this was kind of the way things were going, and that it would be very unlikely to recover. Maybe some of these policies change and do have a big positive impact on study abroad. I agree. It would be great to continue the exchange, and graduate students and undergraduate students alike bring a lot to the country. The inventor of the N95 filtration mat material was a Taiwanese student in the U.S. So there's a lot of bright minds, but I just thought that was the way things were headed, and at least coronavirus would have an impact on study abroad and students' comfort with coming to the United States or just other countries in general.
It was a very interesting topic, and we're very excited that you've made it to this phase, and congratulations. So applause.